So we, over the last 3 weeks, have been teaching our annual series on financial management, biblical principles of financial management called Fresh Start. And we've got 1 week to go of that series, but we're going to just take a little pause today, have a little Steve Hall sorbet, and we'll come back next week with the fourth and final installment of our Fresh Start series. But Steve, he's one of our great friends. He's a teaching team member of Elevate Church. And by the way, the last message that Steve spoke, which was about 2 months ago, was a message called Take a Real Rest. There we go. It was actually the most watched message and online experience so far this year. So maybe there's something that you need to go back and check out if you missed that one. Take a Real Rest is the title you're looking for. And look, in 2025, I think it's very pertinent. So it's probably not a surprise that it's gone to number one. Anyway, Steve's back with us today for another fresh, one-off, hope-filled message. Here he is, Steve Hall.
Hi again, Elevate Online. It's so good to be here, and thank you for taking time out and listening. Depending on how long that is, will determine how much you get out of this. But today, my plan isn't to give you any great revelation. It's not to give you any incredible teachings, but hopefully to start a conversation you might have, like I have, a conversation that's been growing within me. Or maybe it might be a conversation that you have with others as we dig through a word that has really hit me. And I guess the question is, out of this conversation, I would ask you, do you want more love? Do you want to love better? Do you want to have a greater sense of belonging? Have more joy? Greater courage? Be more creative? To actually feel at peace with yourself? Because if the answer to any of that is a yes, then this conversation, I believe, is significant and it's important and it needs to grow. I don't think this is something we learn. I think it's something that we grow within us. And if that is the case, then maybe this conversation would be the pathway to releasing some of that. For me, this all started about a month ago now when I was asked to speak at a school of ministry. And as I was preparing for this school of ministry, the topic they gave me was how to minister to the vulnerable. And I got my notes together, I got my PowerPoints together. I'd done this talk once before, so it was quite good. And I thought it was anyway, until I sat there and I started going through this material. And all of a sudden, I had this incredible question. It's like a sense of doubt that just came within me, which was, do I know how to minister to the vulnerable? Do I minister to the vulnerable? What does that look like? Who are the vulnerable? And at that point, my message started to fall apart because I had these questions I was really grappling with. So I got to the School of Ministry and there's the students all sitting and all sit there with their notebooks, all waiting for some great teaching or the how-tos to minister to the vulnerable. And I started off my message with, well, today we're talking about ministering to the vulnerable. But the truth is, I don't know how. The truth is, I'm not sure anymore. Now, that's not a good way to start a talk to a bunch of students who are there to learn and have probably got to write some sort of article or reflection that the speaker has just told you, I don't know. But I did say this. I said, as I looked at it, I said, I believe to minister to the vulnerable, you first have to be vulnerable. In other words, if I am going to be of help to those who are hurting in our society, I've first got to be in touch with my own vulnerability. So I looked up the word vulnerable, and of course the word vulnerable comes from a Latin word that actually means to be wounded or capable of being wounded. And so as I looked at my own vulnerability, it's actually a preparedness for me to actually discover my own woundedness, my own shortfalls. And so the topic today, and my title today, I thought was best put like this: the pathway to a successful life, or the pathway to success, is vulnerability. Which sounds really crazy in a society where we promote this idea of making sure we looked okay and that looks were important and how I look was important. I don't want you to see what's behind my looks. That we have this idea of our social media where we're pretending to be vulnerable, but really what we're doing is we're just presenting the person that we want people to know, not the real us. So what would that look like if we were to say success is actually found in the pathway to vulnerability? Now, when I'm saying this, I think it's important to note too that there is unwise vulnerability. I'm not saying just go and share your dirty laundry everywhere. I mean, what I'm saying is that we need to understand what's unwise and what's wise. Like the unwise is sharing too much. Have you ever been that place where you've actually shared too much and you've walked away going, I shouldn't have said that? I went to a church once, and the person who was speaking got up and started to describe their dark secrets, their sexual sins. And I'm sitting there with my hands on my ear going, too much information. This is not good. My visuals are not doing great. And then I looked around and I thought, how's his wife coping with this? Sometimes I think being too vulnerable, we need to understand that it's not wise. It impacts others. It opens up pathways of thought. So I think we've got to be wise in what we share, how we share. We need to be wise in who we share with. You can share with the wrong people. Can I suggest you don't go and share with your boss that you're not coping too much, because there's a good chance they'll find someone else. Or maybe there's some times when you're sharing things with people that really shouldn't know that. Or maybe, and in my business, in rehabs with the Teen Challenge, it's important that you share with safe people, because otherwise your information could be all over the place. And all of a sudden now you are defined by your secrets rather than defined by who you are. And I think that you've got to be wise in who you share with, wise in who you're being vulnerable with. And I also want to suggest that we need to be wise in the motive of being vulnerable. Am I being vulnerable just so you think, oh, woe is me, I share all my problems? That sounds like, as I say, in the business that we're in, we kind of encourage people not to share all their story, because sometimes we're so busy telling our own story, we don't hear other people. And being vulnerable is also the ability to take in other people's stories. So I want to suggest to you there's a wise and there's an unwise. And we need to be careful that we understand what we're talking about if vulnerability is the pathway to a successful life. See, wise vulnerability is the preparedness, for me anyway, my definition, to face my shame. We all have a shame vault. And in the words of a lady that speaks so well, the guru of vulnerability, and I encourage you to listen to the TED Talk or even go on Netflix and hear her conversation. Brené Brown, who's done a study on shame, and her comment was, shame is the fear of not being connected, or the fear of being connected, or disconnected. In other words, that whole idea that if I share my truth with you, will you like me anymore? If you knew the real Steve, would you actually be listening to me right now? If you knew who I really was. And so my fear of being disconnected means that I keep secrets in what I call my shame vault, that vault inside me that hides all those things that I don't want you to know about. And sometimes they sneak out. And when they sneak out, all of a sudden, then I find that I'm vulnerable and you don't like that feeling. So you push away from people. But I think real vulnerability is a preparedness that we have, that we look at knowing and being aware of who we really are. You remember the story of Adam and Eve back in the Garden of Eden, right at the beginning of the Bible? That story everyone in the world knows about. And they had this amazing connection with God. They were really connected. Obviously, they had conversations. They walked with him at night. It was according to the records of Genesis. And then they went and got tempted to eat the apple. Now, that wasn't an Apple iPhone, or even though that's the source of all knowledge. But they went to the apple tree and they ate of their apple, and all of a sudden they discovered who they really were, and therefore were shameful. And they had to hide from God. I love that, because God still came looking for them. Even in our shame, God still comes looking for us. Even in our shame, he still knocks at the door and says, I actually want to connect with you. Even in my shame, God arranged to come on earth in the form of Jesus to come and engage with us in our shame. So his desire is, but our desire is to hide that. And we push people away, and we even push sometimes God away. Brené Brown put it this way. She said, owning our story can be hard, but not really as difficult as spending our lives running from it. Embracing our vulnerabilities is risky, but not nearly as dangerous as giving up on love and belonging and joy. The experiences that make us the most vulnerable, only when we are brave enough to explore the darkness will we discover the infinite power of our light. Isn't that so true? And so our journey, and that's why you can't just do this as a 3-point sermon. This is actually a life experience of how do I actually allow myself to discover the real me, and not only discover the real me, but still find my worth in the real me. I think James in the Bible, it's believed to be the brother of Jesus, wrote a letter, and it's called James. And it says here in James 5:16, confess your sins. In other words, be open about who you are, even in that shame vault, to each other, and pray for each other. In other words, allow God to be part of that you may be, and here's the word, healed. In other words, that you can be made whole again. You can be made real again. You can be made what you were supposed to be, a person of love, a person of joy, a person of ability to be able to give to others. And that's a successful life, I believe. Because it says the earnest prayer of a righteous person has the great power and produces wonderful results. But it starts off with allowing those secrets, that shame vault, that areas of our lives where we actually don't want people to know, actually allowing ourselves to enter that, to be aware that those are the things that God wants to be part of. Paul, the apostle, everyone knows Paul the apostle, he was back there in the early church. And he writes this letter to the Corinthian church, but you need to understand what was happening here. This is about 50, 60 years after Christ's death. Now, the church, after Jesus died, right, on the cross, we know that he died and he gave the Holy Spirit to build the church. In those first 300 years, Christianity went like wildfire all over the world, and especially in Rome and here Corinth, which was a mixture of Rome and Greek. It flooded the place because it was countercultural. See, in Rome in those days, strength, power, success, how you looked was important. They were They were a dominant society. And yet here comes this group of people, called themselves Christians, living under the teachings of a gentleman called Jesus, who was the Son of God, so more than a gentleman, who said the opposite to them. See, they said power was what you need to have. He was saying to do the opposite. He was actually saying, love your enemy. He was actually saying, bless those that hurt you. He was actually saying things such like it's better to be poor than rich. And everything was so opposite. And so this group of people called Christians started to live differently. And the people of the world then just struggled. In fact, they got so caught up with this that they started doing brutal persecutions. I mean, if you read some of the early 300 years, some of what the things they did to Christians, simply because they couldn't handle this new type of thinking. They crucified them upside down. They crucified them on cross to make them so shameful, and yet they still wouldn't give up their Christianity. They put them on poles in their gardens and lit them just as an entertainment. It was brutal. If you want to know what went on, you read some of the writings of that early times. And yet Christianity kept growing. And that was confusing. And yet when Paul writes this in 2 Corinthians 12:8, you could imagine how confusing that would have been in a society which lived on dominance and liked to show people's weaknesses. And this is what he said in 2 Corinthians 12:8. 3 different times I begged the Lord to take this away. And he was talking about this thorn in the flesh. Everyone's been questioning that, but there was obviously something that was a thorn to him. Some people think it was a secret sin. Some people thought that it was something to do with relationships of the past. Some people think it was a physical illness. We're not clear. But there was something that was holding him back. And he said, I kept asking God to take this away. And each time he said, my grace is all you need. Jesus said that in his own teachings. My grace is all you need. The concept of grace there is actually I see it as God's acceptance. God's acceptance to give you what you don't deserve. My grace is sufficient. My grace is all you need. Well, how can I receive your grace unless I allow you into the deepest parts of my life? So Paul is saying that all God says to him is, my grace is all you need. My power works best in your weakness. So now, I am glad to boast about my weakness, Paul says, so that the power of Christ can work through me. That's why I take pleasure in my weakness and in the insults, the hardships, the persecution and troubles that I suffer for Christ. For when I am weak, then I am strong. Can I suggest to you that verse means an awful lot to me personally? And even as I go through the season I'm going through now, and I'm going, God, this is the greatest time. If you're in your weakest time, if you're in your most troubled time, this is an exciting time for you. Because if you can be real about it, if you can open up your innermost being and actually embrace it, that's when God says, all you need is me to accept you. All you need is for me to engage with you. All you need is for me to connect with you. But I can't connect with you if you're living out of shame. I can't connect with you if you've got this stuff inside that you're not prepared to look at. If you're living a false life, I can't connect with you. If you're trying to live a life that looks like you're good and you're the perfect Christian and you're the perfect whatever, God says, well, I can't get close to that. But when you recognize that in this, I actually need someone else, then God's greatness. And what's his greatness? This is God's greatness. His love, his joy, His ability to be able to do things through you that you could not imagine. He said, greater things will you do. That his connection with you is more than just a ticket to heaven. It's actually this life that we talked about before, a successful life of being you. But it starts with being vulnerable. And that place of vulnerability, for me anyway, is actually allowing myself to embrace who I am, to embrace my pains, to embrace my fears, to embrace those things that I grieve about. Allow myself to embrace those. And then invite God into that. Allow him to be part of that. Sometimes it means verbalizing it, because remember, our minds tend to just go around in a circle. When we verbalize it or write it down, it's making ourselves very vulnerable. And when we're vulnerable, that's when the light shines in. And that's when you start to love better. That's when you start to be able to forgive people better. That's when you start to be able to have a joy in your life that goes beyond your circumstance. So I want to encourage you as we go through this. I love this comment. It says, what makes you vulnerable makes you beautiful. What a great statement. What makes you vulnerable actually makes you beautiful. There's another quote from Brown. It says this: vulnerability is the birthplace of love, belonging, joy, courage, empathy, and creativity. It's the source of hope, empathy, accountability, and authenticity. If we want greater clarity in our purpose or deeper and more meaningful spiritual lives, vulnerability is the path. Your journey of a successful life is not achieved by your ability, is not achieved by your successes as the world sees it. But your real successful life is to discover the real you. Is to discover, to know that in that real you, you have great worth. That's what God says. The real you has great worth, not the pretend you or the you want to be, but the real you. Because that's the person Jesus gave his life for. That's the person that Jesus wants to fill up with all that he is. That's the person who wants to release the gifts of heaven. He wants to release it on that real person of you. And when we discover that real person, when we go through that journey, I believe that's when we become successful for life. Successful in the life that you were here for. Because you see, the real you is the person who's worthy of relationship, not the pretend you. The real you is the person who's able to give relationship of value. So I leave you with that thought, that conversation. I'd love you to journey it. I'd love you to look for more stuff and more scriptures and more information, because I truly believe that the pathway to a successful life is vulnerability.